In the 1970s, there was a significant demand for a fun, cute, small, inexpensive car. And the Ford Motor Company sought to meet this demand with a car that they called the Ford Pinto. The Pinto weighed less than 2,000 pounds, and it cost less than $2,000. Now, unfortunately, the Pinto had a major design flaw. Due to the way that the fuel tank was positioned, a low-speed crash was sufficient to tear the fuel neck away from the tank or puncture it, and that would spill fuel and create a serious fire hazard. Now, when this flaw was discovered, Ford had a couple of options. One thing they could do is they could correct the design flaw. Another option was to do nothing. And they, in fact, chose to do nothing. And the reason why is that they thought that fixing the design flaw, even though it only would have cost $11 per vehicle, would have not been cost effective. Well, the way Ford figured this out was that they estimated the number of people who were expected to be killed or seriously burned because of the design flaw. They assigned a value of $200,000 to the cost of a death and $67,000 to the cost of a serious burn. And they found that the resulting figure was lower than the cost of making the upgrades. Now, the Ford Pinto case is a really important case in business ethics because it's a clear example of unethical behavior. So in particular, what we want to say is that the Ford Motor Company behaved unethically. But there's something weird about that statement. Is Ford itself, as opposed to its employees, the sort of entity that even can have moral responsibilities at all? Now, one possible answer to this question is no. And there's a straightforward argument for this conclusion. I'm going to present that argument now. So premise one, only persons have moral responsibilities. Premise two, the Ford Motor Company is not a person. Conclusion, therefore, the Ford Motor Company doesn't have moral responsibilities. Now, what I want you to do is to pause this video now or just go back a minute and write down the argument that I just gave. That's very important because I want you to be able to refer back to the premises of the argument as we go on. Because later I'm going to be calling them premise one and premise two and conclusion rather than spelling them out. So that'll just be really helpful if you have it written down. Now, the argument's valid. And to see whether it's sound, though, we're going to need to defend the premises. So we'll begin by assessing premise two, and we'll just assume that premise one is true. But we'll go back and examine the truth of premise one later on in the video. So what's a person? When we ask that question, philosopher Peter French thinks that there are three distinct things we might be asking. So one thing we might be asking is about the legal personhood. So which entities, according to the law, are persons? Another question you might be asking about is something called metaphysical personhood. This question is asking which entities have the properties that are essential properties of persons. Now, asking this question is kind of like asking the question, what properties are essential properties of diamonds? And which things have those properties? And in this case, diamonds, the answer is pretty straightforward. We go out in the world, we look around, we find that all the diamonds are composed of carbon atoms. There's other properties, but that's one of them. In the case of persons, something like the ability to make rational choices, to act for reasons, to make free choices. Those are often taken to be essential properties of persons. Now, a final question that Peter French thinks we might be asking when we ask whether corporations are persons is about moral personhood. Which entities can be the bearers or recipients of moral obligations, or be subject to moral blame or praise? Now, since we're interested in figuring out whether the Ford Motor Company has moral responsibilities, we're concerned with the question about moral personhood. And what we want to know is this: is the Ford Motor Company a moral person? Now, some philosophers think that being a metaphysical person, so satisfying the conditions of metaphysical personhood, is a necessary condition for being a moral person. So if you believe that only metaphysical persons are moral persons, then it's fairly straightforward to argue that the Ford Motor Company is not a moral person. All you have to do is argue that corporations aren't metaphysical persons, that they don't satisfy the essential properties of persons, and that the legal term corporate person doesn't refer to a person over and above the people inside the corporation. And one thing to do this is to say that only biological persons are metaphysical persons. On this view, a corporate person is just a collection of persons, a collection of biological persons. And this is analogous to what happens when we arrange 5 grains of rice on a table. So it's a collection of 5 grains of rice on the table. But the word collection doesn't itself refer to an additional 6th grain of rice. And in the same way, the legal term corporate person doesn't refer to an additional person over and above all the persons who compose the corporation. I want to call this view the legal aggregate theory of corporate personhood. Now, if that was confusing, go back, listen to it again. It's kind of a lot to take in. But that's the beauty of YouTube. You can go back and watch it again. Now, Peter French, who I referred to above, thinks that the legal aggregate theory is false. It's ridiculous. And to see why, let's distinguish between mobs and corporations. Now, a mob is when a large group of people act in a way that has some coordination. And sometimes mobs kill people in acts of vigilante justice. Sometimes they create artistic events, in the case of flash mobs. Other times they storm the United States Capitol and place it under control of a shirtless Viking. Corporations are like mobs in the sense that they also involve large groups of people acting in coordinated ways. But what's really important is that their organization is very different from that of a mob. In a corporation, people are coordinated with one another in complex decision-making hierarchies. They have what is known as a corporate internal decision-making procedure, CID, as French calls it. Now, a theory that says that corporations are no more than collections of people leaves out this distinctive feature of corporations. It fails to distinguish between corporations and mobs. So here's French's alternative theory. He doesn't think that an entity must be a metaphysical person in order to be a moral person. Roughly speaking, French thinks that an entity is a moral person just in case that entity intends to perform some action. Now, this idea is rather complicated, and I gave it sort of a rough characterization so far. So what we're going to do is explore what it means in greater depth so that we can really see what French's position is. Suppose that Jack and Jill walk up a hill holding buckets with the intention of filling them with water. Now, it's clear that Jack is a moral person and that Jill is a moral person. Both of them are performing an action, walking up the hill with an intention, the intention of filling a bucket of water. Now, what's important is that we can describe the whole scene without needing to refer to a third person called Jack-Jill that is made out of both Jack and Jill. We can get along perfectly fine just referring to Jack's intention and to Jill's intentional actions. To put it another way, any references to the intentions of Jack-Jill, which will be this term that refers to the collection of Jack and Jill, can be replaced by references to the intentions of Jack and the intentions of Jill, and the actions that result from those intentions. And so for this reason, Jack-Jill isn't itself an entity that acts on the basis of an intention. Jack-Jill is redundant. But when it comes to a corporation, we also have to refer to the intentional actions of the corporation over and above the intentional actions of all of the biological persons inside the corporation. The intentional action of designing and building the Ford Pinto was not an intentional action committed by any individuals on their own. Lee Iacocca, the president, asked his engineers to build a car that would be under $2,000 and under 2,000 pounds, but he did not know what gas tank his engineers would use. His engineers were operating under the significant constraints placed upon them by their boss. And we have no reason to believe that they wanted to sacrifice safety for money. It seems plausible that they were simply following orders and saw no other way to meet the requirements of their job. Now, through Ford's hierarchical decision-making procedures, an intention to make a particular car in a particular way was formed and acted on. That being said, no single individual person, no single biological person had this intention. The intention is found instead in Ford's hierarchical decision-making structure and policies themselves, instead of within any biological person. And so when we're discussing the intention to build the Ford Pinto, we cannot simply replace references to the Ford Motor Company's intentions with references to the intentions of the engineers or the managers of Ford. For this reason, we need to refer to Ford itself. And we're talking about the bearer of the intention to make the Ford Pinto. And therefore, the Ford Motor Company performs intentional actions. Therefore, the Ford Motor Company itself is a moral person. Unlike what was the case with Jack and Jill, Ford Motor Company is not redundant in our explanations of the intentions. Now, let's return to the argument that we started with, so that way we can kind of keep track of how much progress we've been making. So we've been criticizing premise 2 from the argument. So I'll just read the argument again. Premise 1, only persons have moral personhood. Premise 2, Ford Motor Company is not a person. And then conclusion, therefore the Ford Motor Company doesn't have moral responsibilities. So, according to Peter French, premise 2 is false. Now, it's tempting to just say, all right, job well done, we figured it out, corporations are persons, and move on. But we're not done yet. It's important to look at the alternative perspectives and see if there are any ways containing those perspectives of arguing that the Ford Motor Company is not a person after all. I'm going to talk about the business ethicist Toby Sharding now. So Toby Sharding draws on the work of another ethicist called Robert Jackal. And she presents an argument that goes like this. So Sharding critiques French's claim that corporations exhibit intentionality. And she does this by asserting that corporations are chaotic bureaucracies in which employees attempt to please their bosses. In this picture, we can't simply look at a corporate internal decision-making structure and see an intention to manufacture a $2,000 car with an unsafe gas tank. Instead, what we find are individual people acting on the basis of a variety of intentions. There's the intention to show up to work on time, the intention to save money, the intention to follow orders, the intention to please one's bosses, and etc. We can look high and low, but the only thing we're going to find is this messy web of intentions that doesn't anywhere include a corporate person that intends to do the thing that we would like to blame the Ford Motor Company for having done. Now, if Sharding's argument succeeds, then we're going to have a good reason to reject French's claim that the Ford Motor Company is a person. Now, I'm just speaking personally. I'm not sure whether her argument succeeds. But at the very least, it's a serious challenge to French's argument. We can't just assume that French is right. We're going to have to do some more digging. Now, I don't have time to do that digging here. But what we're going to do now is move on to premise 1. So, premise 1 was that only persons have moral responsibilities. One reason to think that this claim is true, that only persons have moral responsibilities, comes from Immanuel Kant. So in Kantian ethics, you have several different kinds of moral duties. You have perfect duties, to refrain from using another person merely as a means. And you also have imperfect duties of beneficence, to promote the welfare of others. That being said, the only kinds of entities who can have these duties are rational beings who can act for reasons. If you want a deeper discussion of this point, go back to my lecture on moral theories where I discuss Kant. If persons are the only beings who meet this condition, then it follows that only persons can have moral responsibilities. Now, that being said, Sharding follows Matthew Altman and suggests that this is actually a reason to reject Kantian ethics in favor of other moral theories that can hold groups responsible for their collective behaviors. Neither Sharding nor Altman advocates for an alternative moral theory, but I want to conclude this presentation by just considering a couple of options. So one option we have for an alternative moral theory that might tell us that collectives can have moral responsibilities is to say that the collective is responsible for every consequence of any action performed by the collective. And furthermore, that we should punish every member of the collective for any action performed by the collective. If we accept this quite extreme view, we should conclude that the Ford Motor Company, as a collective, is responsible for creating an unsafe car. In addition, we should punish all of the employees, from the custodians up to the CEO, for having created an unsafe car, without any regard for what their individual role was in the endeavor. Now, this is a very extreme position, and according to Steven Swerdlick, this position is far too extreme. And what Swerdlick says is the following. He goes, "It would be unfair, whether we are considering a result produced by more than one person's action or by a single person, to blame a person for a result that he or she did not intend to produce." So another option comes from the philosopher Virginia Held. Now, Held believes that the individuals within a group can be held responsible for the actions of the group if those individuals could have prevented the group actions, but chose not to do so. And in the case of the Ford Motor Company, the Ford Pinto, what we can see is that the custodians wouldn't be responsible in Held's theory. But Lee Iacocca is. Now, it's not clear whether any individual engineer should be held responsible on Held's theory, because it's not clear exactly whether they could have prevented the Pinto from being created. But at least we have another way of thinking about group responsibility that isn't quite as extreme as the first one that we started with. So there's some options out there. So we're nearing the end of our video, so let's take stock of what we've accomplished. We've been discussing the following argument. Premise 1. Only persons have moral responsibilities. Premise 2. The Ford Motor Company is not a person. Conclusion. Therefore, the Ford Motor Company does not have moral responsibilities. Now, recall that the argument was valid, and what we needed to do was figure out whether the premises were true. We need to figure out whether it was sound. I began by looking at premise 2, represented Peter French's argument against it. Then I gave Scharding's argument against French's position. Further inquiry could reveal that premise 2 is false, but it's beyond the scope of what we're going to do here to offer a definitive position on that question right now. That being said, even if it is the case that corporations are not persons, are not moral persons, we don't need to accept premise 1, because there are lots of approaches to ethics that allow us to hold collectives morally responsible for actions, even if those collectives aren't persons. Now, sorting out the details of those approaches and defending one in particular is also a task that would take us beyond the scope of what I'm going to be doing here. But the point is this. We needn't accept the conclusion that the Ford Motor Company doesn't have moral responsibilities, because you don't have to accept that only persons have moral responsibilities. And we also don't need to accept yet, until we do more inquiry, that corporations are not persons.